Richard Blackwood stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a chessboard he had long ago mastered. At 58, he commanded a business empire worth over $2 billion, built from the ground up through steel determination and an unwavering belief that success meant never showing weakness. His pharmaceutical company employed thousands, and his name appeared on hospital wings and university buildings across the country. The mahogany desk behind him held photographs of his achievements, shaking hands with senators, cutting ribbons at grand openings, accepting awards from prestigious organizations. But tucked in the corner, almost hidden behind a stack of quarterly reports, sat a single photo that told a different story. In it, a young girl with bright eyes and an infectious smile sat in a wheelchair, her arms wrapped around a golden retriever puppy. Sarah Blackwood, his 17-year-old daughter, had been born with spina bifida. The condition left her unable to walk, confined to a wheelchair that Richard secretly saw as a symbol of everything imperfect in his otherwise carefully constructed world. He loved his daughter deeply, but that love came wrapped in layers of protection, control, and an unspoken shame that he could never quite shake. The Blackwood mansion sat on 15 acres in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city, surrounded by manicured gardens and wrought iron gates that kept the world at bay. Inside, Sarah lived a life of quiet luxury and profound isolation. Private tutors came and went like ghosts, teaching her everything from advanced mathematics to classical literature. The finest doctors made house calls, ensuring her medical needs were met without the embarrassment of public hospital visits. Richard told himself he was protecting her, giving her the best life possible. But the truth was more complicated. He was protecting himself from the stares, the whispered conversations, the pity he imagined in people's eyes when they saw his disabled daughter. In his world of corporate boardrooms and charity galas, weakness was a liability, and Sarah's condition felt like a crack in the perfect facade he had spent decades building. Sarah, meanwhile, spent her days in the mansion's library, losing herself in books about faraway places and adventures she could only dream of experiencing. She painted watercolors by the large windows, capturing scenes of the gardens she could see but rarely visited. Her only regular companion was Maria, the family's housekeeper, who had worked for the Blackwoods since Sarah was small. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that her father, a man who had built his fortune creating medicines to help people, couldn't seem to accept his own daughter's medical condition. She watched him from her window sometimes, pacing in the garden during his phone calls, his voice carrying snippets of business deals and strategic plans. He was always planning something, always building something, always moving forward. But when it came to her, he seemed frozen, trapped in a protective bubble that was slowly suffocating them both. On this particular October evening, Richard was planning what he considered his masterpiece, a charity gala to raise money for children's medical research. The irony of hosting a fundraiser for disabled children while keeping his own daughter hidden away never occurred to him. He saw it as separate, different. Those other children were worthy causes to be helped from a distance. Sarah was his responsibility to protect. The guest list read like a who's who of the city's elite. Politicians, business leaders, celebrities, and socialites would gather in the grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel, the most prestigious venue in the city. They would eat 5-course meals prepared by award-winning chefs, bid on exotic auction items, and write generous checks that would fund research for years to come. As Richard reviewed the evening's program, he felt the familiar satisfaction of a plan well executed. Every detail had been considered, every potential problem anticipated and solved. The entertainment would be tasteful, the speeches inspiring, the overall experience designed to encourage maximum donations while making his guests feel good about themselves. What Richard couldn't anticipate, couldn't plan for, and certainly couldn't control, was how one unscripted moment at that gala would shatter the carefully constructed walls he had built around his life and his daughter. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest cracks, and for Richard Blackwood, that crack would come in the form of a simple question from Sarah that he had been avoiding for years. The question would force him to choose between the safe, controlled world he had created and the messy, unpredictable, beautiful reality of allowing his daughter to truly live. The request came during breakfast on a Tuesday morning that started like any other in the Blackwood household. Sarah sat at the long mahogany dining table, picking at her Eggs Benedict while her father read the Wall Street Journal behind a wall of newsprint. The morning light streamed through the tall windows, casting geometric patterns across the Persian rug. But the silence between father and daughter felt heavier than the crystal chandelier hanging above them. Sarah had been thinking about the gala for weeks, ever since she overheard Maria talking to the florist about centerpiece arrangements. She knew about her father's charity events, had seen the photos in society magazines that Maria sometimes left where Sarah could find them. In those pictures, her father looked different, relaxed, smiling, surrounded by people who seemed genuinely happy to be in his presence. "Daddy," Sarah said quietly, setting down her fork with a gentle clink against the china plate. "I want to come to the gala." The newspaper rustled as Richard lowered it slightly, his eyes appearing over the financial section like a wary animal peering from behind cover. "What gala, sweetheart?" He knew exactly which gala, but buying time had become his default response to any request that might complicate his carefully ordered world. Sarah straightened in her wheelchair, summoning courage she had been building for months. "The charity gala this Saturday. The one for children's medical research. I want to attend." The newspaper folded completely now, and Richard set it aside with the deliberate movements of a man trying to maintain composure. His daughter looked beautiful in the morning light, her long brown hair catching golden highlights, her green eyes bright with hope and determination. She looked so much like her mother had at that age before the accident, before everything changed. "Sarah, you know these events are complicated. There are stairs, crowds of people, photographers. It wouldn't be comfortable for you." The words came out in his practiced tone of reasonable authority, the same voice he used to explain why certain business deals wouldn't work or why expansion into new markets was premature. But Sarah had anticipated this response. She had been planning this conversation like a chess match, thinking several moves ahead. "The Riverside Hotel has wheelchair accessibility. I checked their website. They have ramps, accessible restrooms, and elevator access to all floors. And I've been taking those social etiquette classes you arranged. I know how to handle formal events." Richard felt something cold settle in his stomach. His daughter had done research, prepared arguments, planned ahead. She wasn't making a childish request. She was making an adult demand. "The guest list is very specific, Sarah. Important people who expect certain atmosphere." "You mean they don't expect to see someone like me?" The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating in their honesty. Sarah had never been one to dance around difficult truths, a trait that both impressed and terrified her father. "That's not what I meant." But they both knew it was exactly what he meant. Richard stood and walked to the windows, his hands clasped behind his back in his habitual thinking pose. Beyond the manicured lawns, he could see the city where he had built his empire, conquered his fears, and created a version of himself that the world respected and admired. Sarah wheeled her chair around to face him. "I'm 17 years old, Daddy. I've never been to a party, never danced with anyone except Maria in the living room, never worn a real evening gown. I want one night to feel like I'm part of your world instead of something you need to hide from it." The word, hide, hit Richard like a physical blow. He had never thought of it that way, had always framed his choices as protection rather than concealment. But hearing it from Sarah's perspective, he couldn't deny the truth in her accusation. What if something goes wrong? What if you need medical attention? What if people stare? The questions tumbled out, revealing the depth of his fears and anxieties. Then something goes wrong and we deal with it. People stare at lots of things, Daddy. They stare at your success, your wealth, your power. Why should my wheelchair be any different? Sarah's voice was gentle but firm, carrying a wisdom that made Richard realize his daughter had grown up while he wasn't paying attention. Maria appeared in the doorway, sensing the tension but pretending to focus on clearing breakfast dishes. She had watched this family for years, had seen the love between father and daughter constrained by fear and misunderstanding. She had also seen Sarah grow from a shy child into a thoughtful young woman who deserved the chance to shine in her father's world. Richard turned back to his daughter, seeing not the medical condition he had spent years trying to manage, but the strong, intelligent, beautiful young woman she had become despite his overprotection. The realization was both proud and heartbreaking. "One condition," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "You don't leave my side the entire evening." Sarah's face lit up with a smile that could have powered the entire mansion. "Deal," she said, extending her hand for a formal handshake that made Richard laugh despite himself. As he took her small hand in his larger one, Richard felt the first crack in the walls he had built around their lives. He had no idea that by Saturday night those walls would come tumbling down completely, changed forever by a moment of music, movement, and the courage of a young black server who would see his daughter not as a problem to be managed, but as a person deserving of joy. The Riverside Hotel's grand ballroom had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing rainbows across walls draped in midnight blue silk, while centerpieces of white orchids and silver candles created intimate islands of light throughout the vast space. The city's elite had arrived in their finest attire, their jewelry catching the light as they moved between cocktail stations and silent auction displays. Sarah Blackwood entered the ballroom beside her father, and for a moment even Richard had to admire how stunning his daughter looked. Maria had helped her choose a deep emerald dress that complemented her eyes, and her hair was swept up in an elegant style that made her look older, more sophisticated. Her wheelchair had been polished to gleaming perfection, and she wore it with the confidence of a young woman who had finally been given permission to claim her place in the world. The initial reaction from the guests was exactly what Richard had feared. Conversations paused mid-sentence as heads turned to take in the unexpected sight of Richard Blackwood's disabled daughter, making her debut at one of the city's most exclusive social events. Some faces showed polite curiosity, others barely concealed surprise, and a few displayed the kind of patronizing sympathy that made Richard's jaw clench with protective anger. But Sarah seemed oblivious to the stares, her face glowing with excitement as she took in the opulent surroundings. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined," she whispered to her father. And Richard felt a stab of guilt as he realized how many beautiful things he had kept from her in the name of protection. They made their way through the crowd, Richard introducing Sarah to business associates and social acquaintances, with the formal politeness that had served him well in the corporate world, but felt strangely inadequate in this moment. Most people were kind enough, asking Sarah polite questions about her education and interests, but the conversations felt stilted, artificial, as if everyone was carefully avoiding the obvious reality of her wheelchair. Marcus Williams moved through the ballroom with the fluid efficiency of someone who had worked dozens of similar events. At 24, he was one of the hotel's most trusted servers, known for his professionalism, his warm smile, and his ability to anticipate guests' needs before they voiced them. He had worked his way through college serving at events like this, and now, while pursuing his master's degree in social work, he continued working at the hotel to pay his bills and support his younger sister's education. Marcus had noticed Sarah the moment she entered the ballroom, not because of her wheelchair, but because of the pure joy radiating from her face as she looked around the decorated space. In his years of working these events, he had seen countless wealthy guests who seemed bored by luxury, taking their privileges for granted. But this young woman was drinking in every detail like someone seeing magic for the first time. As the evening progressed, Richard found himself relaxing slightly. Sarah was handling herself beautifully, engaging in conversations with grace and intelligence that made several guests comment on what a remarkable daughter he had raised. But Richard noticed that she kept looking toward the dance floor, where couples were beginning to sway to the gentle jazz music provided by the live orchestra. The longing in her eyes was unmistakable, and it broke Richard's heart. He had learned to dance at cotillion classes decades ago, but the idea of dancing with his daughter in her wheelchair in front of all these people felt overwhelming. What would people think? How would it work mechanically? What if they looked ridiculous? Sarah seemed to sense his discomfort and turned her attention back to the auction items, pretending to be fascinated by a vacation package to Tuscany. But Marcus, refilling water glasses at a nearby table, had caught the entire silent exchange. He had seen the yearning in the young woman's eyes, the protective hesitation in her father's posture, and the moment when she chose to sacrifice her own desires to spare her father's discomfort. The orchestra began playing "The Way You Look Tonight," a classic that had couples throughout the ballroom moving toward the dance floor. Richard watched his daughter watching the dancers, her fingers unconsciously tapping the rhythm on her wheelchair's armrest. He knew he should ask her to dance, knew that any loving father would overcome his own discomfort for his child's happiness, but the weight of all those watching eyes felt paralyzing. That was when Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Setting down his water pitcher, He approached their table with the same confident stride he used to navigate the ballroom's service demands. His uniform was crisp, his smile genuine, and his eyes held a warmth that immediately put Sarah at ease. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Sarah directly rather than her father. "I hope you don't mind me saying so, but you look absolutely beautiful tonight." "That color is perfect on you," Sarah blushed, surprised and delighted by the unexpected compliment from this handsome young server, who was treating her like any other woman at the gala, rather than someone to be pitied or carefully handled. Richard tensed, unsure where this interaction was heading and instinctively protective of his daughter's feelings. But there was something about the young man's demeanor that gave him pause, a genuine respect and warmth that seemed to see Sarah for who she was rather than what she couldn't do. Marcus turned to Richard with polite deference. "Sir, I hope you'll forgive the liberty, but I noticed your daughter enjoying the music. Would you mind if I asked her to dance?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything Richard thought he knew about his daughter's limitations, about social expectations, and about what was possible when fear stopped dictating choices. Time seemed to stop in the grand ballroom as Marcus's question echoed in the sudden silence that had fallen around their table. Richard stared at the young black server who had just asked to dance with his disabled daughter, and for a moment, every prejudice and protective instinct he had ever harbored crashed together in his mind like opposing waves. Sarah's eyes widened with a mixture of hope and disbelief. No one had ever asked her to dance before, and the possibility seemed so foreign that she almost didn't dare to believe it was real. She looked at her father, her expression caught between excitement and the learned habit of waiting for his permission before engaging with the world. Richard's first instinct was to say no, to politely decline and protect his daughter from potential embarrassment or himself from social judgment. The rational part of his mind cataloged all the reasons this was inappropriate. Marcus was working, they were in public, people were watching. Sarah couldn't really dance, it would look strange. It might be dangerous. But as he looked into his daughter's hopeful eyes, Richard saw something that cut through all his careful reasoning. He saw 17 years of dreams deferred, of music enjoyed only in solitude, of a young woman who had learned to shrink herself to fit into the small space her father's fears had carved out for her. And in that moment, the love he felt for his daughter finally overpowered the fear that had been controlling his choices for years. "I think," Richard said slowly, his voice carrying an emotion he rarely allowed others to see, "that would be wonderful." Sarah's gasp of joy was audible, and Marcus's smile broadened as he moved around the table to face her wheelchair. Other guests had begun to notice the unusual scene unfolding, and conversations grew quieter as people turned to watch what would happen next. "I have to admit," Marcus said to Sarah with charming honesty, "I've never danced with someone in a wheelchair before. You might have to teach me how to make this work." His acknowledgement of the situation without making it seem like a problem immediately put Sarah at ease. "I've never danced with anyone before," she admitted with a laugh, "so we can figure it out together." Marcus positioned himself beside her chair, offering his hand with the same courtly gesture he might use with any woman. Sarah placed her small hand in his larger one, and he began to move slowly, guiding her wheelchair in gentle circles and turns that matched the rhythm of the orchestra's music. At first, their movement was tentative, experimental, as Marcus learned to anticipate the wheelchair's momentum, and Sarah discovered how to use her upper body to express the music's emotional flow. But gradually something magical began to happen. The mechanical aspects of their dance faded into the background as they found their rhythm together. Sarah closed her eyes and let herself feel the music in a way she had never experienced before. Marcus's strong hand guided her chair through elegant patterns across the dance floor, while her free hand moved gracefully through the air, painting invisible pictures to match the melody's curves. Her face radiated pure happiness, and for the first time in her life, she felt the intoxicating freedom of moving to music with another person. Marcus proved to be a natural partner, adapting his movements to complement rather than lead, treating Sarah's wheelchair as simply another element of their dance rather than an obstacle to overcome.
He spun her gently, guided her in flowing figure eights, and even managed a modified dip that made her laugh with delighted surprise. The other guests had stopped pretending not to watch.
Some held champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. Others had phones discreetly raised to capture the unprecedented scene. But the expressions on their faces had evolved from curiosity to something deeper, recognition that they were witnessing something genuinely beautiful and transformative. Richard stood at the edge of the dance floor, his hands clenched at his sides, watching his daughter experience joy in a way he had never allowed himself to imagine possible. Tears gathered in his eyes as he saw Sarah's face illuminated with happiness, her body moving with a grace and confidence that had nothing to do with her legs and everything to do with her spirit, finally being given permission to shine. As the song reached its crescendo, Marcus executed a final flourish, spinning Sarah's chair in a smooth circle before bringing her to rest facing her father. She was breathless with laughter, her hair slightly mussed from the movement, her cheeks flushed with excitement and exertion. The ballroom erupted in spontaneous applause, not the polite social clapping typical of such events, but genuine appreciation for something beautiful they had just witnessed. Several people were wiping away tears, and others were smiling with the kind of warmth that comes from seeing barriers broken and assumptions challenged. Marcus bowed slightly to Sarah, then extended his hand to help her smooth her hair back into place. "Thank you for the honor of that dance," he said formally, but his eyes twinkled with shared joy. "Thank you for showing me what I've been missing," Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion and gratitude. As Marcus returned to his duties, moving through the crowd to refill glasses and clear plates, he seemed to carry some of the light from their dance with him. Several guests stopped him to comment on what they had just witnessed, and more than one person asked about making donations to organizations that support disabled individuals. But the real transformation was happening at table 12, where Richard stood looking at his daughter with new eyes, finally beginning to understand the difference between protecting someone and empowering them, between love that limits and love that liberates. The drive home from the gala passed in companionable silence, both father and daughter lost in their own thoughts as the city lights streamed past the limousine windows. Sarah sat with her evening gown spread carefully around her chair, her face still glowing with the residual joy of her first real dance. Richard found himself stealing glances at his daughter, seeing someone he felt like he was meeting for the first time. Back at the mansion, Sarah was too energized to sleep. Instead, she asked Maria to help her into her regular clothes and made her way to the library, where she often went when her mind was too active for rest. Richard, loosening his bow tie and removing his cufflinks, found himself drawn to the same room, as if some invisible thread connected him to his daughter's emotional state. He found her by the large windows that overlooked the gardens, staring out at the moonlit landscape with an expression he couldn't quite read. For 17 years he had thought he knew his daughter completely, had believed that his careful management of her life was exactly what she needed. Tonight had shattered that certainty. "Sarah," he said softly, settling into the leather chair beside her, "we need to talk." She turned from the window, her face serious now that the magical spell of the evening had faded into reality. "Are you angry about what happened tonight?" The question surprised Richard. "Angry? Why would I be angry?" "Because people were staring. Because it probably looked strange. Because Marcus is black and we've never, she trailed off, uncertain how to articulate the complex social dynamics she had observed throughout her sheltered life. Richard felt something cold and shameful settle in his chest as he realized his daughter had picked up on prejudices he thought he had hidden, assumptions he hadn't even fully acknowledged to himself. The truth was, part of his initial shock at Marcus's request had indeed been about race, layered beneath his concerns about disability and social propriety. "Sarah, I want you to understand something," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Tonight, watching you dance, seeing you happy in a way I've never seen before, it made me realize that I've been failing you as a father." Sarah's expression shifted to concern. "Daddy, you've given me everything. The best doctors, the finest education, this beautiful home. I've given you things," Richard interrupted gently, "but I haven't given you life. I haven't given you the chance to make mistakes, to take risks, to discover who you are when you're not being protected from the world." The admission hung between them, heavy with years of missed opportunities and misguided love. Richard continued, his voice growing rougher with emotion. "That young man Marcus saw you tonight in a way I've been afraid to see you. He saw someone worth dancing with, someone deserving of joy and romance and all the experiences I've been telling myself you couldn't handle." Sarah wheeled closer to her father's chair. "I know you were trying to protect me, But from what? Richard asked, the question that had been haunting him all evening finally finding voice. From people staring? People have always stared at success, at wealth, at power. From potential embarrassment? We all embarrass ourselves sometimes. From getting hurt? Everyone gets hurt, Sarah. It's part of being alive. He leaned forward, taking his daughter's hands in his own. I think I've been protecting myself more than you. Protecting myself from having to see you face rejection, from having to watch you struggle, from confronting my own fears about your condition. I made your disability about my comfort instead of your growth. Sarah squeezed her father's hands. So what do we do now? The question was simple, but the answer felt revolutionary. We start over, Richard said. We start with you telling me what you actually want from life, not what I think you should want or what I think is safe for you to want. A slow smile spread across Sarah's face. I want to go to college. Not online courses, but real college, with other students and professors and dining halls and maybe even parties. Richard nodded, though the thought terrified him. What else? I want to travel. I want to see art in museums instead of just in books. I want to eat food I've never tasted, and hear music I've never heard, and meet people who don't know anything about me except what I choose to tell them. With each item on her list, Richard felt both pride in his daughter's courage and shame at his own limitations. Anything else? Sarah hesitated, then spoke with the boldness that dancing had awakened in her. I want to see Marcus again, not because he's the only person who's ever asked me to dance, but because he's the first person who saw me as someone worth getting to know instead of someone to be careful around. This request challenged Richard most directly, forcing him to confront not just his protective instincts but his own unconscious biases about race and class. Marcus was a server, a young black man working his way through school. Everything Richard's social programming suggested was inappropriate for his daughter's attention. But as he remembered Marcus's genuine kindness, his natural dignity and the way he had treated Sarah with respect and warmth, Richard realized his objections had nothing to do with Marcus's character and everything to do with his own prejudices. Then we'll invite him to dinner, Richard said, the words coming out before his fear could stop them. A proper dinner here at the house so I can get to know the young man who made my daughter smile the way her mother used to smile. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of gratitude and love for a father who was finally choosing growth over comfort, possibility over protection. They sat together in the moonlit library, planning a future that felt both terrifying and full of promise while outside the windows. The gardens that had once seemed like walls began to look like gateways to a larger world. 6 months later, the Blackwood mansion hummed with an energy that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known the family before the gala. Sarah's acceptance letter to the University of Chicago lay framed on Richard's desk, right beside the photo of her that was no longer hidden behind quarterly reports but displayed prominently, where visitors could see his daughter's bright smile. The dinner with Marcus had been the first of many. What started as Richard's attempt to properly thank the young man who had given his daughter such joy had evolved into a genuine friendship that surprised everyone involved. Marcus's intelligence, ambition, and deep sense of social justice had impressed Richard, while his easy comfort with Sarah's disability had taught the older man lessons in acceptance he was still learning. Marcus was finishing his master's degree in social work with plans to advocate for disability rights, inspired partly by watching Sarah navigate a world that wasn't designed for her. Their relationship had grown slowly, built on shared conversations about books and music, dreams about making the world more accessible, and the kind of deep understanding that comes from seeing each other clearly, without pretense or protection. Richard had surprised himself by becoming Marcus's mentor in ways that had nothing to do with his daughter. The young man's nonprofit work needed funding and connections, and Richard discovered a new sense of purpose in using his wealth and influence to support causes that directly impacted people like Sarah. His latest project was funding wheelchair-accessible renovation of the city's oldest theater, ensuring that future generations of disabled individuals wouldn't be excluded from cultural experiences. The mansion itself had been transformed. Ramps now provided elegant access to the gardens where Sarah could often be found painting landscapes in plein air. The library had become a meeting space for the disability advocacy group Sarah had founded, bringing together young people who shared her experiences and her determination to change social attitudes. Maria watched these changes with quiet satisfaction, remembering the lonely girl who used to sit by the windows dreaming of adventures she thought she'd never have. Now Sarah was planning a summer internship with a disability rights organization in Washington, D.C., her first step toward the law degree she hoped to pursue after college. The most profound transformation, however, was in Richard himself. The man who had once measured success solely in financial terms now found meaning in much smaller moments. Watching Sarah laugh with her friends, seeing Marcus present his research at academic conferences, receiving thank-you letters from families whose children benefited from his newly established medical scholarship fund for disabled students. He had also begun speaking at medical conferences, sharing his perspective as both a pharmaceutical executive and the father of a disabled child. His talks focused on the importance of seeing patients as whole people rather than collections of symptoms, and his advocacy had led to new initiatives in patient-centered care at hospitals across the country. On this particular evening, Richard stood in the same spot by his office windows where he had stood 6 months earlier, but everything about his perspective had changed. Below, in the garden that was no longer a barrier but a bridge between their private world and the larger community, Sarah and Marcus were setting up tables for the fundraising barbecue they had organized for the local Disability Resource Center. Friends from Sarah's advocacy group worked alongside. Marcus's graduate school colleagues, donors from Richard's business network laughed with families from the resource center, and Maria supervised the food preparation with the satisfaction of someone who had watched her family finally become whole. Richard's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Dad, come down and help us. Stop hiding in your office and join the party." He smiled at the playful command that would have been unthinkable in the past, when he had trained his daughter to be as invisible as possible. As he made his way downstairs, Richard reflected on how a single moment of courage, his decision to let Marcus ask Sarah to dance, had created ripples that were still expanding outward. Sarah's college applications had inspired other disabled students to pursue higher education. Marcus's research was changing how social workers approached disability advocacy. Richard's funding was creating opportunities for countless families facing similar challenges. But perhaps most importantly, they had all learned that love, without the courage to let someone be fully themselves, isn't really love at all. It's just fear dressed up in protective clothing. Richard stepped into the garden to find Sarah directing the placement of a banner that read, "Everyone deserves to dance," the slogan for their latest fundraising campaign. She turned and waved him over with the easy confidence of someone who had learned to take up space in the world rather than apologize for her presence in it. As he walked toward his daughter, Richard thought about the man he had been before that October evening. Successful but limited by his own fears, loving but constrained by his own prejudices. That man had built walls to protect what he valued most, not realizing that walls designed to keep pain out also keep joy from getting in. The man he was becoming understood that the most profound protection he could offer his daughter was not shelter from the world, but the tools and confidence to engage with it fully. Sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give is not safety, but the courage to be unsafe in all the ways that make life worth living.